Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you the perfect excuse why families of critically ill patients in intensive care have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. You can check out last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to show you why the often strictly academic view of the intensive care team might hold you back from peace of mind, control, power, and influence. When you and your family are challenged with this once-in-a-lifetime situation of having a loved one critically ill in intensive care, and when you and your family feel and think that you are in a situation where you are frustrated, in fear, you are stressed, overwhelmed, and you have no peace of mind, control, power, and influence, you must know that you are not alone. 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care know and feel like they have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. And especially if you and your family are facing those inevitable challenges when your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is approaching their end of life in intensive care. If you are in one of those situations, you know exactly what I'm talking about here, because after I have worked literally with thousands of critically ill patients and their families in more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, I have effectively dealt with, supported, counseled and guided families of critically ill patients in intensive care through this once-in-a-lifetime challenge over and over again. And look, the reality and the fact of the matter is that if you, your family and your critically ill loved one are dealing with one of those massive once-in-a-lifetime challenges where your critically ill loved one is in one of those big challenging situations they can ever go through in intensive care, you know that you really have no idea where you should be putting your efforts towards, and you really don't know what questions you need to ask, and worst of all, you really have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Even worse, you and your family feel like the intensive care team is talking over you rather than entering into a genuine dialogue with you. The intensive care team may be very vague in their communications with you, and you can literally feel that your loved one's fate and destiny appears to be in the intensive care team's hands. Peace of mind, control, power, and influence for you and your family seem to be terms that are a million miles away. Even worse, during those challenging, frustrating, difficult, and often heartbreaking experiences where your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or if they are having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or if they are even approaching the end of life in intensive care. The intensive care team seems to be using terms, words, and expressions that are very clinical, very academic. They may even sound threatening and intimidating. And at the end of the day, they are using their academic jargon that can be rather intimidating for families of critically ill patients. After all, the members of the intensive care team must be very smart, very accomplished, and they must know what they are doing. Right. Isn't that what society has wrongly conditioned us for centuries, that doctors must know what's best? Isn't that what we are all meant to believe? But I also bet that deep down you and your family don't want to be kept at arm's length. You and your family don't want to be at the mercy of the intensive care team during one of those challenging, frustrating and once-in-a-lifetime situations when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. What you and your family don't know is that most decisions in intensive care are made behind the scenes and behind closed doors. The positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis during one of those challenging and once-in-a-lifetime situations that I mentioned before, as well as the treatment and the care that your critically ill loved one may receive or not receive, is a direct result from what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. It's basically a direct byproduct from the intrigue, the dynamics, the power play, the psychology and the hidden agendas from the intensive care team. Intensive care, after all, is a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. Intensive care beds tend to be in high demand and very expensive, and the bottom line is that you and your family are involved in a high-stakes game and you didn't see it coming. You see, because you have found yourself in such challenging, dramatic, frustrating and once-in-a-lifetime circumstances, the intensive care team has no intention to relinquish any control, power and influence over to you. The stakes are too high for the intensive care team, period. The problem is that the stakes are even higher for you, for your family and most of all for your critically ill loved one. After all, the very life, the very well-being and the very recovery of your critically ill loved one are in the intensive care team's hands, or at least that's what you think, and that's how it's being framed and positioned by the intensive care team. The reality and the fact of the matter is, however, that the intensive care team loves to use their strictly academic views as a weapon and positioning tool once your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. It's not only a weapon for positioning, for power and for perceived superiority, it's also a weapon used by the intensive care team so that you and your family don't get to see what's happening behind the scenes and behind closed doors in intensive care. Once again, with intensive care being such a dominant and important multi-billion-dollar per year industry, you need to very quickly understand that the decisions and the positioning about your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis from the intensive care team always is driven from the financial viability of your critically ill loved one's stay in intensive care from the ICU team's perspective. For example, the intensive care team will consider whether they will make money or whether they will lose money by treating your critically ill loved one. Imagine in an end-of-life situation with severe head or brain injuries, you don't want the treatment and the care of your loved one dependent on the intensive care unit's budget, or do you? Also, the intensive care team will look at the bed status and the bed situations in the intensive care unit. For example, will continuing treatment on your critically ill loved one block a bed for other patients who are in need of a precious and expensive intensive care bed? And does the intensive care team think that other patients would be more interesting to treat, or would they be financially more viable? Again, you don't want the treatment and the care of your loved one dependent on other admissions needing an ICU bed, or do you? Also, another big one. Medical research interests of the intensive care team. Medical research is a multi-million-dollar per year industry, and many intensive care units rely on those revenue and funding streams in order to not only perform medical research on real human beings without often informing vulnerable patients and their families, and without giving them or their families a choice. Intensive care units, however, rely heavily on those income and funding streams that comes from medical research. Once again, you don't want the treatment and the care of your loved one being dependent on the intensive care team's medical research interests, or do you? The reality and the fact of the matter is that by the intensive care team's strict academic view of clinical situations, you and your family are kept at arm's length. And with this strict academic view, the intensive care team is consciously or unconsciously trying to position themselves as a superior authority that always, quote-unquote, knows what's best. That positioning doesn't leave any room for you and your family's input. In fact, the strict academic view of the intensive care team is directly targeted at families of critically ill patients to not have any peace of mind, control, power and influence if you don't challenge it. It's basically the clashing of two worlds. There's you and your family anxiously and passively awaiting the news about your critically ill loved one, and there is, on the other hand, the perceived power, the perceived authority from the intensive care team that's cemented by their academic achievements and by their academic expert opinion. The reality and the fact of the matter is that this academic expert opinion is difficult to be challenged if you don't know what questions you need to ask, if you don't know what's happening behind the scenes, and if you are not massively taking action towards having peace of mind, control, power and influence. How can you have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How you can eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You will get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.